back in the 70s in Chicago, when kids peeked out their windows and saw a smiling clown holding colorful balloons. They thought it was gonna be a night full of laughter and fun. But nobody had a clue that behind that painted grin and cheerful costume was one of the most terrifying serial killers America's ever known. John Wayne Gacy, a name that still sends chills down your spine. A man who'd spend his days dressing up as a clown for kids' parties, spreading joy, and then turn into a hunter at night. A hunter whose prey were young boys and teenagers, more than 30 of them. 33 lives buried right under his own damn house, beneath the same roof he slept under. The responsibility to see every human as someone valuable, to never see anyone as disposable, to recognize everyone deserves safety, respect, and love. This is the lesson from the John Wayne Gacy case. Not the story of a killer clown who became infamous, but the story of 33 lives stolen and how we must make sure it never happens again. Let's end by remembering their names. Not all 33, we don't have time, but some of them. Let's say their names and make sure we remember that they were humans, not just victims. Timothy Jack McCoy, 16 years old, loved cars. John Stanley Butkowitz, 18, wanted to be a teacher. Daryl Sampson, 18, a quiet boy with a beautiful smile. Randall Wayne Reff, 15, loved music. Samuel J. Stapleton, 14, the youngest victim. Robert Jerome Peast, 15, wanted to help his family. And 27 others, each with a name, a story, and families who still remember them. Now come with me on this dark trip. We're diving deep into Gacy's story. From his pain-filled, violent childhood, all the way to the night he was caught, and the horror beneath his house was finally revealed. We're gonna figure out how a kid who once was a victim turned into one of history's worst monsters. We'll hear the voices of those who can't speak anymore. We'll see how a man with two faces fooled everyone for years, living like a model citizen by day and committing unspeakable crimes by night. This story's real. It's terrifying, and it shows you that the worst monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they're the ones smiling right next to you. March 21st, 1946. Chicago, a city known for its cold winds and gray skies. In a middle-class neighborhood, a baby was born, John Wayne Gacy. From the outside, they looked like a regular American family. His dad, John Stanley Gacy, was a mechanic and construction worker. His mom, Marion Elaine Robinson, was a homemaker. He had two older sisters. But behind that normal picture was pure hell. The kind of hell that shaped who John Wayne Gacy would become. His father, John Stanley, was a mean drunk. The kind of guy who thought his son had to be tough, had to be a real man. If little John cried, his dad would call him names. say he was acting like a girl. If he wanted to hang out with his mom or help her around the house, his dad would lose it, yelling, cursing, calling him weak and shameful. The word he used the most? Sissy, a cruel insult that told John he'd never be good enough. John had health problems too. A weak heart kept him from running and playing like other kids, and that just made his dad hate him more. The old man thought John was faking it, pretending to be sick just to dodge work. But the truth was, he really was sick. The doctors told him to take it easy, no heavy stuff, but his dad didn't care, called him a liar, said he was lazy. At night, when his dad got drunk, things got ugly. You could hear it from the living room. Shouting, breaking glass, the sound of fists hitting flesh. Little John would curl up in bed, cover his ears, trying to disappear into some quiet world where those sounds didn't exist. But they always did. That house was never safe. His mom, Marion, was kind, but scared, too scared to stand up to her husband. His sisters tried to protect him, but they were just kids too. The house belonged to John Stanley, and nobody dared to fight him. So John learned early, you need two faces, one for the world, one for home. Outside, he'd play the polite, cheerful boy, pretending everything was fine. Inside, he was broken, a scared kid who'd been told over and over that he was worthless, weak, shameful. When he was 9, something else happened, something that scarred him even deeper. A family friend, a grown man, started molesting him. It happened more than once. John didn't know what to do, who to tell. He knew if he told his dad, he'd be called a liar, maybe even get beaten and blamed for it. So he stayed quiet. He kept that secret buried inside, rotting away for years. And years later, when Gacy got caught and the psychiatrists talked to him, he mentioned those years, said that was when he realized the world ain't a safe place. He said he realized that power was everything, that whoever had power could do whatever they wanted. That belief became his life's core. Power, control, dominance. In school, John struggled. He didn't fit in, couldn't connect with the other kids. His sisters later said he always tried to get people's attention, wanted to be liked, wanted approval. But every time he felt rejected, that deep anger inside him grew. An anger that would explode years later in horrifying ways. As a teenager, John realized he was attracted to boys, something that, in the 1950s and 60s, was completely condemned by society. For John, who'd been told by his father to be a man, that attraction felt like the ultimate failure. He thought his father had been right. He really was a sissy. He tried to suppress it, to convince himself he was normal. Later, he even got married, trying to prove to himself and the world that he was a straight, normal man. But those feelings never left. They just sank deeper, waiting for the day they'd come out. At 18, he left home to start a new life, but the old scars came with him. That scared little boy who cried himself to sleep, was now a young man searching for power, for control over something, anything. He went to business college, started working different jobs. He was good at talking to people, good at earning their trust, a skill that would later help him trap his victims. In 1964, he met Marlon Myers, a sweet young woman from a well-off family. Her father owned several KFC franchises. They got married. It looked like the start of a perfect life. Marlon's father, Fred Myers, offered John a job managing one of his restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa. John accepted, moved there, and started his new life. 2 kids followed, a son and a daughter. From the outside, he looked like the ideal family man. But behind that facade, darkness was growing again. John got active in the community, joined the JCs, even became president of the local chapter. Everyone thought he was a generous, upstanding citizen. But really, he was already hunting. The young boys who worked at his restaurant became his prey. He'd invite them over, give them alcohol, and try to make sexual advances. If they resisted, he threatened them, told them no one would believe them. "I'm respected. You're nobodies." In 1968, one of those boys, Donald Voorhees, reported him for sexual assault. At first, no one believed it. How could John Gacy, the beloved JC's president, be a predator? But when more boys came forward, the truth unraveled. Police investigated. Gacy denied it all, claimed extortion. But the evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Marlon was shattered. She filed for divorce immediately, took the kids, and never looked back. John lost everything: his family, his job, his reputation. In prison, he put on a show of reform, worked hard, volunteered, became head cook. The staff thought he'd changed. After just 18 months, he was released early for good behavior. And that's when he came back to Chicago. His mom was still living there, so John went back to stay with her. His dad, John Stanley, had passed away a few years earlier. Even up to his final breath, John's father had never really approved of him, never once told him he was proud. That haunted John. He felt like he'd spent his whole life trying to earn his dad's approval, but no matter what he did, it was never enough. Now, John wanted a fresh start. He wanted to prove to the world that he was a good man, that he could actually build a decent life. He started working as a cook at a local restaurant, and after a while, he launched his own small construction business. He called it PDM Contractors. He did painting, remodeling, and repair work himself, and business was good. Clients liked him. In 1972, John met a woman named Carol Hoff. She was a divorced mom with 2 daughters. John painted himself as a changed man, someone who'd made mistakes but learned from them. Carol believed him. They got married, and John bought a single-story house in a neighborhood called Norwood Park. From the outside, it looked plain and ordinary. But that same house would later become one of the most horrifying Crime Scenes in American History. By now, John Gacy was a 40-year-old man who, on the surface, seemed to have it all together. His business was growing, and he was hiring lots of young guys to work for him. Carol and her daughters lived with him, and he'd become active again in the community, joined local clubs, showed up at neighborhood parties. Everyone thought John Wayne Gacy was this kind, friendly guy. But what no one knew was that John was slipping back into his dark urges. The young men who worked for him, he found them attractive. He started inviting them over to his house, telling them he needed help with odd jobs. He'd offer them drinks, try to get closer to them. At first, John only wanted sex, but something inside him was changing. The anger that had been festering since childhood was starting to take another form. John felt like he needed total control. He couldn't stand being told no, couldn't stand resistance. In 1972, John claimed his first victim. His name was Timothy McCoy, a 16-year-old kid who worked for him. One night, Timothy came over to John's house. John gave him alcohol and then tried to make a move. Timothy resisted. He said no. That one word, that rejection, broke something inside John. Later, John said that in that moment, something snapped in his head. He felt like Timothy was disrespecting him, making him feel weak. All those years of his father calling him worthless, all those moments he felt powerless, they all came flooding back at once. John grabbed a knife. Timothy tried to run, but John was stronger. He stabbed him several times. The young boy fell to the ground, bleeding out. John just stood there, watching as Timothy died. John later said that in that moment, he felt pure power. For the first time in his life, he felt completely in control. That feeling became like a drug to him, something he'd crave again and again. Timothy was dead. John carried his body down to the basement. Underneath the house, there was this crawl space. John started digging. He moves the dirt aside, made a small pit, and buried Timothy there. Carol wasn't home that night. Neither were her daughters. When they came back, John was sitting on the couch watching TV, acting like nothing happened. When Carol asked about the strange smell in the house, John said it was probably a plumbing issue. He'd fix it tomorrow. Timothy McCoy's family reported him missing. The police investigated, but there were no leads. Timothy was a runaway kid, someone people assumed had just taken off. The case slowly faded away, and that's when John realized he could get away with it. He could kill, and no one would ever know. That realization was basically a death sentence for dozens of young men to come. Over the next few years, John kept killing. He had a pattern. He targeted young guys, usually the ones who worked for him or were just looking for a job on the street. By now, John Gacy was a 40-year-old man who, on the surface, seemed to have it all together. His business was growing, and he was hiring lots of young guys to work for him. Carol and her daughters lived with him, and he'd become active again in the community. Joined local clubs, showed up at neighborhood parties. Everyone thought John Wayne Gacy was this kind, friendly guy. But what no one knew was that John was slipping back into his dark urges. The young men who worked for him, he found them attractive. He started inviting them over to his house, telling them he needed help with odd jobs. He'd offer them drinks, try to get closer to them. At first, John only wanted sex, but something inside him was changing. The anger that had been festering since childhood was starting to take another form. John felt like he needed total control. He couldn't stand being told no, couldn't stand resistance. In 1972, John claimed his first victim. His name was Timothy McCoy, a 16-year-old kid who worked for him. One night, Timothy came over to John's house. John gave him alcohol and then tried to make a move. Timothy resisted. He said no. That one word, that rejection, broke something inside John. Later, John said that in that moment, something snapped in his head. He felt like Timothy was disrespecting him, making him feel weak. All those years of his father calling him worthless, all those moments he felt powerless, they all came flooding back at once. John grabbed a knife. Timothy tried to run, but John was stronger. He stabbed him several times. The young boy fell to the ground, bleeding out. John just stood there, watching as Timothy died. John later said that in that moment, he felt pure power. For the first time in his life, he felt completely in control. That Timothy was dead. John carried his body down to the basement. Timothy McCoy's family reported him missing. The police investigated, but there were no leads. Timothy was a runaway kid. Someone people assumed had just taken off, and that's when John realized he could get away with it. He could kill, and no one would ever know. That realization was basically a death sentence for dozens of young men to come. Over the next few years, John kept killing. He had a pattern. He targeted young guys, usually the ones who worked for him or were just looking for a job on the street. He'd invite them over to his place, tell him he'd got work for him, or say he'd pay him. When they showed up, John would give them drinks, alcohol. Sometimes he'd slip in sedatives too. Once the guys got all fuzzy and loopy, John would move in. His usual way of killing was by choking. He had this trick he'd show his victims, called it the rope trick. Said he was gonna do a magic trick. He'd wrap a rope around the guy's hands and tell him he was gonna show how to get free. But then he'd stick a stick into the rope and start twisting. The rope tightened up. The guy would start struggling, but it was already too late. John liked watching them fight, liked seeing the fear in their eyes. It gave him a rush, a feeling of power, control, the thing he'd been chasing his whole life. After he killed them, John took the bodies down to the basement. In that empty space under the house, he started burying them. 1, 2, 3, more and more piled up. Sometimes he layered the bodies. Sometimes he shoved a few into one pit. Carol, John's wife, started getting suspicious. The stink in the house kept getting worse and worse. John said the sewer was acting up, or there were dead rats in the walls. Carol believed him. She couldn't imagine her husband doing something like that. But there were other things Carol noticed. John stopped sleeping with her. He was coming home late at night. Sometimes weird noises came from the basement. Once, Carol went down and saw John digging. She asked what he was doing. John said he was just leveling the basement floor. Why young guys went to his house and never came back. During this time, John built another persona. He started performing as a clown at kids' parties. He made his own clown costume and put on makeup. He called the character Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown. He'd show up at local parties, charity events, hospitals. Kids saw John and they laughed. They were happy, but what nobody knew was that the same man who'd been making kids laugh hours earlier would go back out into the streets that night, hunting for his next victim. John's split had reached the extreme. By day, a respectable, friendly man. By night, a predator. One of John's victims was a young man named John Butkovich. Butkovich was 18 and worked for him. One night, Gacy told him to come to the house to finish a job. Butkovich went and never came back. Butkovich's family looked for him. His mother, who loved him, checked everywhere. She went to the police and said her son was missing. The police asked where he was last seen. She said he was supposed to go to work for John Gacy. The cops went to John and asked. John said, yeah, John Butkovich was here, but he left. Said he was headed somewhere else. The police believed him. John Gacy was a respected, well-known man. Why would anyone suspect him? But Butkovich's mother had a feeling. She thought John Gacy was lying. Some of the victims were street kids, runaways nobody was looking for. John knew those kids were the easiest targets. He could kill them and nobody would notice. But some, like John Butkovich, had families who were looking. That was riskier. John didn't care. His addiction to killing was so strong, he couldn't control it anymore. The basement was filling up. There were so many bodies down there that he ran out of room. John had to start dumping some of the bodies into the Des Plaines River, a waterway near sea. He dumped a few of the bodies into the water, hoping they'd never be found. But all that couldn't go on forever. The guy's name? John Gacy. Robert went to meet John. They talked for a bit. John said he might have some work for him and that they'd get in touch later. That night, Robert went home to have dinner with his mom. He told her a man named John Gacy had offered him a job. His mom said, "All right, just be careful." Robert smiled and said, "Don't worry, I'll be back." His mother, Elizabeth Peast, got worried when he didn't show up. She went to the cops and filed a missing person report. She told them her son was supposed to meet a man named John Gacy. This time, the police took it more seriously. A detective named Joe Kozenzak took charge of the case. Joe went to Gacy's house and asked him about it. John said, "Yeah, Robert Peast came by. We talked a little, but nothing happened. He left and I haven't seen him since." But Kozenzak didn't buy it. He dug deeper and found out Gacy had a record. Back in '68, he'd been convicted of sodomy. Joe also found that several other young men had gone missing, last seen working for or visiting Gacy's house. That's when Joe decided to push harder. He got a search warrant and headed to John Gacy's place. December 17, 1978, the day the truth finally came out. Cops entered Gacy's home. At first, they didn't find much. The place looked neat and tidy. John was calm, polite, acting like he had nothing to hide. But one thing stood out, that foul smell hanging in the air. Gacy said it was just the plumbing, the same excuse he'd always used. But the detectives weren't buying it. They went down to the basement, checked the dirt floor. One detective noticed something, a patch of soil that looked freshly dug. He started digging. A few minutes later, he found something, a bone. The team kept digging. More bones. Then a full body. Word spread fast. More police units arrived. They started digging up the whole basement. The deeper they went, the more bodies they found. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The count kept rising. John Gacy was arrested and taken to the station. At first, he tried to deny everything. Said he had no idea how those bodies got there. But when he was faced with the evidence, he couldn't lie anymore. December 22nd, 1978, John Gacy confessed. In the interrogation room, John Gacy sat on a metal chair. His hands were cuffed to the table. Across from him sat 2 detectives. One of them was Joe Kozenzak, the same cop who'd been suspicious from the start. Joe looked at John with a mix of disgust and curiosity. How could one man do so many crimes? Joe started. "John, we've pulled more than 20 bodies out of your house. 20 young men buried under your home. You gonna tell us how they got there?" John was quiet for a while, staring at the table like he was wrestling with himself. Then he started talking, slow. "I didn't want to do these things. There was something in me I couldn't control." "What was that?" "I don't know. Something that when I saw those boys, I couldn't hold myself." Joe leaned in. "John, you invited those boys to your place, gave them booze, choked them, buried them. Those were choices you made. That was control. You had control." John lifted his head and looked at Joe. There was something in his eyes, an emptiness, like there was no feeling behind them. "You don't get it. When they were there, when they were struggling, I felt power. For the first time in my life, I felt in control." "Control of what?" "Control of everything. My whole life, people told me what to do. My dad called me weak. Society told me how to be. But when those boys were there, I made the decisions. I had power. I had control over whether they lived or died. The second detective, who'd been quiet up till then, said, "And you decided they should die?" "Yes." "Why?" John thought for a moment, then said, "Because I could." That answer filled the room with a heavy silence. The detectives looked at each other. This man, this monster, was telling them he'd killed 33 people, simply because he could. Joe drew a breath. "John, we want names. We want to know who each of those boys were, where their families are. Can you help us?" John began to speak. He listed names, one after another. He remembered some, not others. He said, one had brown hair and always laughed. Another was real quiet, didn't say much. Even in those descriptions, there was no feeling. John spoke about the boys like he was describing things he'd bought, not real people he'd killed. Joe asked, "What about Robert Peist, the 15-year-old who went missing 2 weeks ago? Is he one of your victims?" John exhaled. "Yes, Robert. He was the last one." "What happened?" "He came to my house." Joe felt his stomach turn. This man, this monster, was calmly talking about killing a 15-year-old. "What did you do with him after?" "After? I took his body to the basement. But there was no room. The basement was full. I had to put his body in the bedroom, under the bed, while I figured out what to do." The second detective asked. Joe leaned in harder. "John, do you even understand what you did? 33 people, 33 families who are mourning right now. 33 young men who had futures, dreams, lives, and you took them all." John looked down. "I know, but I couldn't control myself. There was something in me that—" "No," Joe raised his voice. "I don't want to hear those lies. You could have controlled it. You chose to do these things. Every time you invited a boy over, every time you put the rope around his neck, every time you buried a body, you were making choices, and you chose to kill." John said nothing more. He just sat there, staring at the table. The interrogation went on for hours. John gave more details, said he dumped some bodies in the Des Plaines River, buried one under his garage, another in his yard. The detectives wrote everything down. Then they took John to a cell. The news spread fast. Reporters showed up. Cameras, microphones. Everybody wanted to know what had happened. John Wayne Gacy's story, the killer clown, became one of the biggest news stories of the year. The families of the victims started showing up at the police station. Moms, dads, sisters, brothers. They all wanted to know if their loved one was one of the victims. The police began identifying the bodies. It was tough. A lot of the bodies were so decomposed, it was hard to figure out who they were. But little by little, one by one, they were identified. John Butkovich, Daryl Sampson, Randall Reff, Samuel Stapleton, Johnny Moncrief. Each name meant a family was finding out that their loved one was gone. Each name was a story that had come to an end. John Butkovich's mom, when she found out her son was identified, felt both relief and sorrow. Relieved because at least she knew what happened. At least she knew where her son was, sorrowful because she had to come to terms with the fact that her son had been buried under the house of a monster for years and nobody had noticed. Robert Piest, the last victim, was identified. His mom, Elizabeth, when she heard the news, fell apart. Only 2 weeks had passed. Just 2 weeks since Robert had gone off and never came back. And now she found out that the same night, the night she was waiting for him, her son had been murdered. Meanwhile, the search of Gacy's house continued. The cops searched everywhere, every corner, every crevice, and the more they dug, the more horrifying things they found. The clothes of the victims that Gacy had kept, jewelry, photos. Each one was a keepsake from a crime. In the garage, they found another body. In the yard, under the bushes, 3 more bodies. The whole house had turned into a graveyard. 5 bodies were pulled from the Des Plaines River. These bodies had been floating in the water, and people had found them. The police had previously thought they were accidents or suicides. Now they realized all of them had been Gacy's victims. The final count was 33. 33 young men between the ages of 14 and 21, all killed by John Wayne Gacy. John Gacy's trial began in February of 1980. The entire country was watching. Everyone wanted to see what would happen to this monster. Gacy's lawyer tried to claim that Gacy was insane, not responsible for his actions. They brought in psychiatrists who said Gacy suffered from severe mental disorders. They said he had multiple personalities, one of which they named Jack was responsible for the killings. But the prosecutor rejected that. He argued Gacy knew exactly what he was doing. He planned his crimes, selected his victims, and hid the bodies. Those were signs of someone in full control of their actions, not a madman who couldn't control himself. Many witnesses came forward. Boys who had escaped from Gacy's clutches. They told how Gacy had tried to make sexual advances, how he had become violent when they resisted. One of them said, "I thought he was going to kill me. The rope was around my neck, and it was getting tighter. But suddenly, he let me go. He said this time he'd forgive me. He said next time I wouldn't be so lucky." This witness was one of the lucky ones. Some weren't so lucky. The families of the victims also came. They sat in court, staring at the man who had taken their loved ones from them. Some were crying. Some were angry. All of them wanted justice. Elizabeth Piest, Robert's mother, testified, "My son was a good kid. He wanted to work, earn money, help his family. He went to this man with good intentions. And this man, this monster, killed my son. He took my son from me." She looked at Gacy, who was sitting calmly behind the defense desk. "I hope you go to hell. I hope every day you spend in prison, you remember what you did. Remember all those boys you killed." Gacy didn't react. He just stared at the desk in front of him, as if the words of this grieving mother meant nothing to him. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The jury deliberated for only 2. The day of John Wayne Gacy's execution. That morning, John had his last breakfast. KFC fried chicken, fries, and a soda. The same meal he'd eaten years ago when he was a fast food restaurant manager. Afterward, they took him to the execution room. There, a table with restraints for his hands and feet awaited. They laid him down on it and strapped him in. Outside the prison, hundreds of people had gathered. Some were the victims' families. They were there to witness justice being served. Others were just curious, wanting to be there when the killer clown finally died. Inside the execution room, a nurse came in. She started inserting needles into John's arms, one for the anesthesia, the other for the drug that would stop his heart. The judge asked, "John Wayne Gacy, do you have any last words?" John looked at him, then said, "Kiss my ass." Those were John Wayne Gacy's final words. Even in his last moments, he showed no remorse, no apologies, just anger and hate. The injection began. First, the anesthesia. John closed his eyes, then the heart-stopping drug. A few minutes later, the doctor stepped forward and checked John's pulse. He shook his head. John Wayne Gacy was dead. Outside, when the news was announced, the crowd erupted in applause and celebration. Some were crying. Others were hugging each other. They felt relief. They felt like the dark chapter was finally closed. But for the families of the victims, this wasn't the end. The pain of losing their loved ones would never go away. John Gacy's death wouldn't bring them back. It just closed a chapter. After Gacy was executed, people started trying to figure out how the hell something like that could happen. How could a man, a seemingly normal citizen, kill 33 people and get away with it for years? What turned John Gacy into one of the worst serial killers in American history? Psychologists and criminologists dug into his case. They looked at his childhood, his relationship with his father, the abuse he'd experienced. A pattern showed up, the same kind you see with a lot of serial killers. Dr. Helen Morrison, one of the psychiatrists who examined him, said, "John Wayne Gacy is a classic example of an antisocial personality. He had no empathy. To him, people were objects to be used. When he was done with them, he tossed them aside like trash." But what Dr. Morrison and others noticed went further. Gacy didn't just lack empathy. He took pleasure in other people's suffering. That's what moved him from a garden-variety antisocial personality to something far more dangerous, a sadist. He liked watching his victims struggle and beg. It gave him a sense of power. That power became an addiction. The more he had, the more he wanted. Another big point experts raised was society's role in how he kept getting away with it. Why didn't anyone suspect him? Why didn't the police take missing person reports seriously? The simple answer: Because the victims didn't matter to a lot of people. Many were runaways, street kids, boys from poor or broken homes. Society treated those folks like disposable people. The assumption was, if they went missing, they'd run off or were living risky lives, not that someone had murdered them. That attitude let Gacy keep going. When John Butkovich's family reported him missing, the cops didn't press it. Same with other families. It only changed when Robert Piest, a kid from a middle-class family with determined parents, disappeared. That's when the police started taking it seriously. This inequality in the justice system became one of the big lessons from the Gacy case. Society had to face the fact that it valued some lives more than others, and that kind of thinking can let killers slip through the cracks. Gacy's old house, the place with those 33 bodies buried beneath it, was torn down. Neighbors didn't want any monument to the crimes. The lot sat empty for a while. Then a new house got built, but everybody knew what happened there. Neighbors said they'd hear weird noises at night, but it showed how deep those crimes had sunk into the community's memory. The victims' families tried to carry on. Some managed, some never did. John Butkovich's mother never came to terms with his death. Every anniversary, she'd visit his grave and cry. Robert Piest's mother, Elizabeth, turned into an advocate for victims' rights. She started working with organizations that support families who've lost someone to violent crime. "I can't bring my son back," she said, "but I can help other families going through this know they're not alone." Elizabeth's work led to changes in the justice system. New laws made police take missing person reports more seriously, especially when young people were involved. National databases were created so different police departments could share info. Those changes couldn't bring Robert or any of the other 32 victims back, but maybe they could stop the next killer. Gacy wasn't the only serial killer who hid behind a respectable face. In the history of serial crime, plenty of killers had normal lives, families, jobs, friends, while a darkness lived behind the mask. Ted Bundy, another notorious serial killer, but at least he killed 30 women. Dennis Rader, who called himself BTK, bind, torture, kill, was a church leader and family man, but he tortured and killed 10 people. Jeffrey Dahmer, who was dubbed the Milwaukee Cannibal, seemed like a shy, quiet guy, but he killed 17 young men and even ate some of their bodies. These killers all had one thing in common: the ability to deceive. They could play the role of an ordinary person, earn people's trust, and that made them even more dangerous. John Gacy with his clown suit, Ted Bundy with his good looks, Dennis Rader with his church leader persona. They all wore masks. Masks hiding the monsters within. One question that's always asked about serial killers is, are they born that way, or are they made? Was John Gacy a monster from birth, or did his experiences turn him into one? The answer is likely a mix of both. Research shows that some people are born with certain tendencies. Their brains are wired in a way that makes empathy harder for them and impulse control weaker. But these tendencies alone aren't enough. The environment plays a significant role. John Gacy grew up in a home full of violence and abuse. His father taught him that emotions were a sign of weakness, that men shouldn't show their feelings. This led to John not being able to deal with his emotions in a healthy way. Instead of learning how to cope with anger or sadness, he learned to suppress them. And those suppressed emotions eventually turned into deep rage that finally exploded. The sexual abuse John experienced also played a part. This experience taught him that sex, power, and violence were intertwined. For him, sex wasn't about intimacy or connection. It was about control and domination. But none of these are excuses. Many people have similar experiences and don't become killers. Many people grow up in abusive homes, witness violence, and never hurt anyone. There was something in John, a choice he made that made him different. Psychologists sometimes talk about a tipping point, a moment when someone with dangerous tendencies decides to act on them. For John, that tipping point was probably the night he killed Timothy McCoy. That night, John crossed a line. And once you cross that line, it's much harder to turn back. After that, each killing was easier than the last. John no longer felt guilty. He didn't see his victims as people anymore. They were just objects, tools to satisfy his needs. The impact of the John Wayne Gacy case went far beyond the families of his victims. The entire criminal justice system in the United States was affected. Before John's case, many states didn't have a cohesive system for tracking missing persons. Each city, each state worked on its own, and information wasn't shared. After the case, public pressure led to the establishment of national systems. The National Crime Information Center, which had already existed, was expanded. New databases were created that allowed different police forces to see if similar patterns were showing up in different areas. The media also played a major role. The Gacy case was one of the first criminal cases to be widely covered by national media outlets. People across the country were hearing this story. It raised public awareness about serial killers. Before this, many people thought serial killers only existed in movies or were incredibly rare. But John's case proved that these people are real. They can live among us, and they are dangerous. This awareness led to changes in how children were educated. Parents started teaching their kids about the danger of strangers. They told them never to go with someone they didn't know, even if the person seemed nice. They told them that if anyone tried to force them, to scream and run away. But these teachings had a flaw. Most child abuse and crimes against children are committed by people the child knows. Family members, family friends, neighbors. The overemphasis on the danger of strangers led to this fact being overlooked. However, public awareness increased. people started paying more attention to suspicious behaviors. If they saw an adult spending a lot of time with kids they didn't seem to know, they would ask questions. If they heard strange noises coming from a neighbor's house at night, they would call the police. This change in social culture may have prevented some crimes. Maybe some potential killers, seeing that people weren't so easily deceived anymore, got discouraged. Gacy also had a deep impact on criminal psychology. Experts started studying more about the minds of serial killers. What makes someone become a serial killer? How can these people be identified sooner? How can these crimes be prevented? The FBI expanded its behavioral analysis unit. This unit, which would later be portrayed in various TV shows and films, began creating psychological profiles of serial killers. They interviewed incarcerated killers, studied their behaviors, and tried to identify common patterns. From these studies, concepts like organized killer and disorganized killer emerged. An organized killer, like John Gacy, is someone who plans ahead, cleans the crime scene, and tries to leave no trace of themselves. A disorganized killer is someone who acts impulsively, has a chaotic crime scene, and usually gets caught sooner. These categorizations weren't perfect, but they helped the police better understand what kind of criminal they were dealing with. Another effect of the Gacy case was the debate about the death penalty. Some argued that the case showed why the death penalty was necessary. They said that someone who had killed 33 people didn't deserve to live. They argued that the only true justice for the victims' families was the killer's death. But others disagreed. How could such crimes happen right next door, and they didn't even notice? One neighbor said, "Every morning when I'd leave for work, I'd wave at John. He'd smile and wave back. He seemed like a polite man. Now, when I think about it, I shiver." They felt like maybe they could have done something. Maybe they could have noticed. But the truth is, John was really good at deceiving people. He'd been practicing for years. He knew how to wear a mask, how to play the part of an ordinary guy. Some people who knew John later said there were signs, but they didn't pick up on them. One said John always talked about control. He'd say that in life, you have to have control. You have to have power. Now I realize he was talking about something else. Another said, "Once I saw John talking to a young guy. The guy seemed upset, like he wanted to leave. But John put his hand on his shoulder, really firmly. The guy stayed. At the time, I thought John was being a good mentor, helping out. Now I think, I don't know. Maybe that kid wanted to run." These maybes, what ifs, are things that John's neighbors and acquaintances still struggle with today. Maybe if they'd paid more attention, maybe if they'd asked questions, maybe they could have saved one of those boys. But the truth is, the responsibility isn't on them. The responsibility was on John Wayne Gacy. He chose to kill. He chose to harm those young boys, and he had to be held accountable. The clown image also changed after John's case. Before John, clowns were mostly associated with joy and laughter. After John, many people started to fear clowns. This fear, known as coulrophobia, had existed before, but it became more widespread after John. Kids who used to be happy seeing clowns, now some of them were scared. Parents were worried. Professional clowns, people who made a living entertaining kids, were affected. One of them said, "John Gacy ruined our job. Now, when I say I'm a clown, people look at me with fear. It's like I'm a potential killer too." It was unfair, but understandable. The image of the clown, which should have been a symbol of joy, became forever linked with the image of John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown. In popular culture, John Wayne Gacy became a symbol of hidden evil, a symbol of danger that can be behind a smile and a friendly face. Lots of movies and books have been made about him. Some tried to understand what made John become what he became. Others just showcased his crimes in a way that some criticized, saying it turned crime into entertainment. One of the overlooked aspects of the John Wayne Gacy case was its impact on the gay community. Most of Gacy's victims were young boys who were either gay or known within the gay community. Gacy himself had these inclinations, though he always tried to deny them. In the 1970s, homosexuality was still something that American society heavily condemned. People who were openly gay faced discrimination, violence, and social ostracism. When the Gacy case broke, and it became known that his victims were young boys, some of whom were gay, the media covered this in a very specific way. Some outlets, particularly conservative ones, tried to frame the case as a danger of the gay lifestyle, as if being gay was somehow linked to being a victim. Gay rights activists tried to explain that Gacy was a killer, not a representative of the gay community. But this message got lost in the media noise. The result was that many young gay men felt that society saw them as insignificant victims. They felt like if something happened to them, no one would care. And unfortunately, this feeling was somewhat true. Later research showed that police typically put in less effort to find missing young gay men than they did for heterosexual boys. This discrimination allowed killers like Gacy to evade justice for longer. Years later, a gay rights activist said, "The John Gacy case was a painful reminder that society values our lives less." Those boys, Gacy's victims, if they were young straight girls, the police would have reacted way faster. But because they were gay boys, or assumed to be, no one cared. This harsh reality was one of the major lessons of the Gacy case. It showed that discrimination and social attitudes can allow killers to escape and victims to be forgotten. Another lesser-known aspect of the case was its impact on those who were part of the investigation team. Detectives, forensic doctors, emergency responders who had to remove the bodies from Gacy's house. All these people faced a horrific scene. Joe Kozenzak, the detective who played a key role in Gacy's arrest, later said that the experience was very hard for him. He said, "I've seen a lot of crime scenes in my career, but nothing prepared me for what I saw at Gacy's house. The smell, the number, The fact that this man had lived there for years and all those bodies were under his feet was a nightmare. Some needed counseling and therapy. One forensic doctor said, "I'd have nightmares every night. The images of those bodies, those young boys, never left my mind. Even now, years later, some days it comes back." The families of the victims who had never known. Experts have pointed out that if John had access to proper psychological services as a child, he might have learned to cope with his trauma in a healthier way. Maybe he never would have become a killer. Of course, that's just speculation. There's no real way to know. But it shows how investing in mental health, especially for children who experience abuse or trauma, can prevent future crimes. Schools began introducing education programs about child abuse. Kids were taught that if someone mistreated them, they needed to tell a trusted adult. They learned that staying silent wasn't right, that speaking up about abuse was brave, not shameful. Those lessons undoubtedly saved lives. Kids who would have once stayed quiet began to speak up. Abuses were uncovered sooner. Children were rescued from dangerous situations earlier. It's been over 40 years since John Wayne Gacy's execution. A new generation has grown up. Many of them have probably never even heard his name. But the lessons from his case are still important. We live in a world where serial killers still exist. Even though our systems for identifying and catching them are better, we still can't completely stop them. John Gacy is a reminder that evil can take any shape. It can come dressed as a clown, with a smile, with open arms. We can't just trust appearances. We have to stay alert, trust our instincts, and look out for one another. Another lesson is that every life matters. We can't let prejudice, poverty, or social rejection make anyone seem disposable. Every missing person should be taken seriously. Every worried family should be heard. And maybe the most important lesson is that we need to care about mental health. We need to support children who experience abuse. We need to help people struggling with trauma. Because when we don't, we create a cycle of pain that can last for generations. John Wayne Gacy himself was once a victim of an abusive father, of the trauma he endured. But that doesn't excuse what he did. He chose to continue the cycle, to pass on the pain he'd received to others. That was his decision. The families of Gacy's 33 victims still live with the pain. Some of the parents, now elderly, think of their sons every day. Some of the siblings, now parents themselves, tell their children stories about uncles they'll never get to meet. One sister, whose brother was murdered at 16, said, "My brother would be 55 now. He should have had a family, kids, a full life. But instead, he's just a photo on my wall, a memory. And the man who took him from me, he still hurts me, even after death. Because every morning, I wake up to the reality that my brother isn't here. That pain never really goes away. Time might dull the sharp edges, but it never disappears. There's always a void, an absence, a question that never gets answered. Why? John Wayne Gacy never gave a satisfying answer to that question. Even in his final days, even in interviews, he couldn't or wouldn't truly explain why he did what he did. He just gave excuses, justifications, tried to paint himself as the victim. But the truth is simple. John Wayne Gacy was a killer, a monster, a man who chose to take 33 lives. And today, the house built on the site of Gacy's old home belongs to an ordinary family. They know the history of that land, but they chose to make it their home. They say they don't want the darkness of the past to overshadow the present. Maybe that's the best kind of answer to evil. Not forgetting because we never should, but moving forward. Building something new on the ruins of what was destroyed. Turning a place of horror into one of peace. John Wayne Gacy's victims deserved to live, to chase their dreams, build families, grow old. But that chance was stolen from them. The least we can do now is remember them. Say their names. Make sure they're known, not just as Gacy's victims, but as real people, with names and stories. Timothy McCoy, John Butkovich, Daryl Sampson, Randall Reffitt, Samuel Stapleton, Billy Carroll, Johnny Mankiewicz, Gregory Godzik, John Sitz, James Mazzara, Robert Gilroy, John Mankiewicz, Russell Nelson, Robert Winch, Tommy Bowling, David Talsma, William Kindred, Timothy O'Rourke, Frank Landingen, James Mazzara, Robert Peast, and the others who still haven't been identified. The bodies that still don't have names. The families who are still waiting. They deserve to be remembered too. The John Wayne Gacy case also had a deep impact on how police handled criminal investigations. Before this case, a lot of modern forensic and detective techniques were still in their early stages. But the complexity of the case, the huge number of victims, and the need for precise identification pushed major advancements forward. One of the biggest challenges was identifying the bodies. Many were badly decomposed. Some were just bones. Traditional methods, like fingerprinting or visual ID, just didn't cut it anymore. Forensic specialists had to turn to newer methods. Dental records became one of the key tools. Everyone's teeth are unique, and if dental records exist, a body can be identified through them. They also analyzed bones to determine age, height, and gender. The forensic teams carefully examined every bone, took measurements, and tried to extract as much information as they could. This process took months. Slowly, one by one, the victims were identified. But even with all that effort, some bodies still remained unknown. Those bodies, known only by numbers, stand as grim reminders of the limits of science and of the fact that some families may never truly know what happened to their loved ones. After Gacy's case, investment in forensic science skyrocketed. Universities started offering more specialized programs. Better equipment was bought, and maybe most important, collaboration between forensic experts, police, and dentists got a lot stronger. Another major shift after this case was the improved use of criminal psychology. The FBI, which had already been working on profiling, ramped up its efforts after Gacy. The idea of profiling is simple. By studying the crime scene, the killer's behavior, and the type of victims, you can build a psychological snapshot of the killer. That picture helps the police narrow their search and understand what kind of person they're dealing with. In Gacy's case, profilers could tell the killer was probably a middle-aged man, someone known in the community, someone with access to young men, maybe through work or social activities. That kind of profile, while broad, could still be useful. After the Gacy case, the FBI expanded its behavioral analysis unit. They started interviewing imprisoned serial killers to understand how these people think, what motivates them, and how they pick their victims. Those interviews, later documented by books like Mindhunter, deepened our understanding of serial killers. We learned they fall into different categories, have different motives, and operate in very different ways. John Wayne Gacy himself was one of the killers studied, though he never fully cooperated. In some interviews, he opened up and explained a few things. In others, he got defensive and clammed up. One interviewer said, "John was a complex guy. On one hand, he wanted to be understood. He wanted people to know what went on in his head. But on the other hand, he just couldn't take full responsibility for what he did. There was always an excuse, always a justification." One major takeaway from studying killers like Gacy was that many of them suffer from an entitlement mindset. They genuinely believe they have the right to do what they do. They think rules are for everyone else, not for them. They see their own desires as more important than other people's rights. In his interviews, Gacy often claimed his victims were troublemakers, that they deserved to die because they had no morals. That kind of twisted logic shows how killers try to justify their actions, even to themselves. Another thing we learned: serial killers often show early warning signs before their first murder. Problem behaviors in childhood, like torturing animals, setting fires, or bedwetting into late years, are common red flags. These three, known as the McDonald Triad, show up often in serial killer histories. Gacy had behavioral issues as a kid, though it's unclear if he displayed all parts of the triad. But it's obvious that something was off early on. If those signs had been taken seriously, if Gacy had gotten proper treatment, maybe history would have turned out differently. Then again, there's no way to know for sure. Plenty of kids show these behaviors and don't grow up to be killers. And some serial killers never show any of those early signs at all. Look, accurate predicting? Yeah, that's tough. But the point is this: those behaviors gotta be taken seriously. A kid who's torturing animals needs help. Maybe they won't turn into a killer, sure, but it's obvious something's wrong and it needs attention. After Gacy was executed, the paintings he did turned into this weird market. People were dropping thousands on a Gacy painting. Collectors, folks obsessed with serial killers, or just people who figured it'd be a smart investment. A lot of folks were pissed about that market. They said we shouldn't let killers profit off their crimes, even after they're dead. Buying those paintings, they argued, is basically celebrating a monster. Some states passed laws, you've probably heard of the Son of Sam laws, to stop criminals from cashing in on their crimes, whether it's books, movies, or paintings. Any money that comes from that stuff gets routed to victims or their families. After Gacy died, a group of activists even gathered up his paintings and publicly burned them. They said, "We don't want anything of this monster left. We don't want his so-called art sitting in museums or collectors' homes. We want it destroyed." They collected over 20 paintings and burned them at a public event. Some victims' families were there. One mother said, "Watching those paintings burn gave me a kind of peace, like a piece of evil was being wiped out." Still, not every painting was destroyed. Lots of them are out there in private collections or even in some true crime museums. The argument over whether to keep that stuff or not hasn't died. One camp says we should keep it as historical record. Even if the images are disturbing, they're part of history. Destroying them would be censoring the past. The other camp says holding on to that stuff glorifies the killer. It lets him keep showing up, keeps the attention on him, even after he's gone. We gotta say the names of his victims too. We need to remember what they lost. We need one of the long-term consequences of the John Wayne Gacy case was the change in how the media reports on serial crimes. Before this case, the media usually only covered local crimes, and very rarely did a case go national. Gacy's case was one of the first to become a major media event. Journalists came from all over the country to Chicago. Every day, new reports were broadcast. Images from Gacy's house, from the investigations, from the families of the victims. Everything was out there for public consumption. This kind of media coverage had its pros and cons. On the one hand, it raised public awareness. People realized that serial killers were real and dangerous. Public pressure led to legal and systemic changes. On the other hand, this widespread coverage sometimes veered into true crime entertainment. The media competed for more details, for more shocking images, and that sometimes came at the expense of showing respect to the victims and their families. Victim families, in the midst of their pain, were forced to deal with cameras and microphones being shoved in their faces. Some said they felt like the media was exploiting their grief, turning their pain into a story for newspaper sales and TV ratings. One family later said, "On the worst day of my life, when I found out my son had been killed, reporters were at my door. As soon as I opened the door, they all rushed at me with cameras and microphones. They were yelling my name, asking how I felt. How do I feel? My son just died. What answer am I supposed to give?" This experience led to the creation of ethical rules and guidelines for the media. Journalists were urged to treat victim families with more respect, to give them space and privacy. But the problem with media coverage goes beyond how the families were treated. The bigger issue is that the media often focuses more on the killer than the victims. The killer's name is everywhere. His face is on magazine covers. His biography is dissected in detail. But the victims? They often just become statistics. 33 victims of John Wayne Gacy. Their names may be mentioned once. They give interviews, write letters, even gain fans. This strange phenomenon, called hybristophilia, refers to being attracted to criminals. And it shows how the media can create a misleading, almost glamorous image of a killer to combat this issue. Some journalists and news organizations started to change their approach. They decided to stop mentioning the killer's names over and over. Instead, they focused on the victims. They told the victims' life stories. Another cultural impact of the Gacy case was the rise in public interest in true crime. This fascination is understandable. People are always drawn to things that are scary and dangerous. Watching or listening to real-life stories of evil and survival can be thrilling, especially when we're safely in our homes. But sometimes, this interest veers into unhealthy territory. Some people become fans of killers. They write them letters, ask for photos, even try to marry them. These behaviors show how society can sometimes romanticize evil, turning killers into anti-heroes. John Wayne Gacy had his fans too. In prison, he received hundreds of letters, some from people who admired him, some from people who claimed they were in love with him. This reality is both unsettling and disturbing. Psychologists say that some people are drawn to criminals because they feel they can save them, or because they're attracted to power and danger. Some people are just chasing the attention and fame that comes from being connected to someone notorious, even if they're infamous. But whatever the reason, these behaviors hurt the victims' families. Imagine someone killed your child, and then you see people writing love letters to that killer. How would that feel? One of Gacy's victim families said, "When I see people buying Gacy's paintings, reading books about him, looking at him as some kind of interesting character, I just want to scream. This man killed my son. He's a monster. Why can't people just forget him and remember the victims instead?" That's a fair request. The victims deserve to be remembered, not their killer. Ultimately, the John Wayne Gacy case was like a mirror, forcing American society to look at itself. It forced hard questions. How could one man commit so many crimes and no one notice? Why do we value some lives more than others? How can we prevent similar crimes in the future? Some of those questions got answers. Systemic changes happened. New laws were passed. Public awareness increased. But some questions still remain unanswered. We still don't fully understand what makes someone become a serial killer. We still can't completely identify these people before their first murder. We still live in a society where discrimination exists, where some people are seen as less important. So the work isn't done. The lessons from the John Wayne Gacy case are still relevant. And as long as we learn and apply those lessons, we have to keep remembering. Remember the victims. Remember their families. Remember the pain and suffering they endured. And remember that every life matters, that everyone deserves safety and respect. John Wayne Gacy is gone. He's dead, and he took with him secrets he never fully revealed. But his legacy, unfortunately, still remains in the grief of families who are still mourning, in the systems that have changed, in the awareness of a society that's learned. And maybe the most important part of that legacy is this: a reminder that evil is real, that it can show up with a familiar face, a friendly smile, open arms, and that we always have to stay vigilant, always protect each other, and always listen to that inner voice saying, something's not right. More than 40 years have passed since John Wayne Gacy was executed. Yet the victims' families are still living with that tragedy. For them, time stopped the day they realized their loved one was Gacy's victim is etched forever in their minds. Elizabeth Peast, Robert Peast's mother, lived until 2012. Until her final days, she commemorated her son's death every year. She would visit his grave, lay flowers, and speak to his photo. She would say, "Robert, I still miss you every day, always." She also spent the rest of her life fighting for legal change. She met with lawmakers, spoke at conferences, and supported other families of crime victims. Her work led to important laws being passed, laws that now help protect young people. When Elizabeth passed away, many attended her funeral. Families of other Gacy victims, victim rights activists, and police who had worked on the case all came. They came to pay tribute to a woman who turned tragedy into strength, who turned pain into purpose. One speaker said, Elizabeth Peast could have fallen apart after Robert's death. She could have let grief and anger destroy her. But she chose to fight. She chose to make something good out of something terrible. And because of her efforts, hundreds of other families experienced a better justice system. Other victim families took different paths. Some, like Elizabeth, became activists. Others tried to return to normal life, to forget, to carry on. None of it was easy. One victim's sister said, "I tried to forget. For years, I tried not to think about my brother, about what happened to him. I thought if I didn't talk about it, the pain would lessen. But the opposite happened. The pain got deeper. Eventually, I realized I had to talk about it, remember him, let my grief be seen." This process of mourning for families of violent crime victims is much more complex than ordinary grieving. They didn't just lose a loved one. They lost them in a horrific way. And that horror, knowing that their loved one suffered, died alone, was scared, never fully leaves them. Psychologists working with victims' families say these people often struggle with guilt. They feel maybe they could have prevented it. Maybe if they had done something different that day, said something different, their loved one would still be alive. This guilt isn't rational. They aren't responsible. And every night before bed, my last thought is my son. It's been that way for 40 years. And I think it will stay that way until the day I die and join him. Yet amidst this pain, families have found sources of strength. The bonds they formed with other families, the support they received from the community, the changes they brought about, and most importantly, keeping the memory of their loved one alive, ensuring that they are not just a Gacy victim, but a full human being with a name, a story, and dreams. Some families established scholarships in their loved one's name. Others created charitable organizations. Some simply hold annual gatherings where friends and family come together to honor and remember them. These are ways families create meaning out of meaninglessness, ways to ensure their loved one isn't forgotten, ways to turn darkness into light. Today, many people know John Wayne Gacy's name. Far fewer can name even one of his victims. This imbalance is something that needs to change. When we talk about serial killers, when we tell their stories, we must first and foremost talk about the victims. We must say their names. We must tell their stories. We must make sure they are remembered. Timothy McCoy was a 16-year-old boy who loved fixing cars. His dream was to one day open his own garage. Good boy who wanted to help his family. Story of John Wayne Gacy. The Killer Clown is a dark, horrifying tale that dives deep into the human soul. It's about how someone who was once a victim can turn into a killer. It's about how society, by ignoring warning signs, can unintentionally aid the continuation of crimes. And it's about how prejudice and negligence can make some lives seem less valuable. But this story isn't just about darkness. It's also about light. The light of families who turned their pain into strength. The light of detectives who didn't give up and chased the truth. The light of lawmakers who changed the rules. The light of activists who fought for justice. And the light of remembering the victims, a light that must never go out. Today, 40 years later, the world looks different. We've got better systems, more awareness, but we're still not perfect. Serial killers still exist. Victims still get overlooked. So the work goes on. The lessons from John Wayne Gacy's case need to keep going. We need to teach new generations how to spot warning signs, how to protect children who are being abused, how to value every life. We need to teach them that behind every statistic, there's a human being, that crime victims aren't just numbers, but people with names, stories, and loved ones who still carry their pain. And we need to make sure that when we talk about serial killers, victims aren't forgotten. They are the center of the story, not the killer. John Wayne Gacy is now a name in the history books, a name always tied to evil and horror. But let's make sure that's not the only thing remembered. Let's make sure Timothy McCoy is remembered as a boy who loved fixing cars, not just the first victim. Let's make sure Robert Peast is remembered as a boy who wanted to help his family, not just the last victim. Let's make sure all 33 of them are remembered as people who lived, loved, dreamed, not just John Wayne Gacy's victims. This is our debt to them, to their families, and to ourselves. Because when we forget, when we let the killer be the only one remembered, in a way, he wins. He gets the fame he wanted, while his victims are forgotten. But when we remember, when we say their names, when we tell their stories, they win. Their lives matter. Their memory lives on. So let's make a promise. A promise to remember. A promise to talk about the victims, not just the killer. A promise to build a society that values every life. A promise to support those who are abused, who are in pain, who need help. This isn't easy. It never has been, but it's necessary. Because the only way to prevent tragedies like this from happening again is to learn from the past, to apply its lessons, to make sure history doesn't repeat itself. John Wayne Gacy died on May 10th, 1994, but his 33 victims died earlier, between 1972 and 1978, each one living in the moment, full of hope, thinking the future was bright. They deserved better. They deserved life, love, happiness, and it was taken from them. But even in that darkness, their families tried to create light, tried to keep their memory alive, tried to make sure the world learned, changed, became better. And we, the ones alive now, have the responsibility to carry that on, to learn, to change, to improve, the responsibility to speak up when someone's in danger, to help when someone is being abused, to fight when systems are unjust. These are the ones who must be remembered. These are the ones whose stories must be told. Not John Wayne Gacy, not the killer clown, not the monster, but them, the victims, human beings, people who lived, loved, and deserved the chance to keep living. Let's keep their memory alive. Let's learn from their story. Let's make sure they are never forgotten. Because this remembering, this speaking, this learning is the only way we can honor them. The only way we can say, we see you, we remember you, and we make sure your lives mattered. Rest in peace, 33 angels. You are not forgotten, and you never will be.